You probably already gathered I'm a kind of a generalist and an enthusiast, but braiding grew from a research interest in the actions of textile manipulation, and I'm going to read my paper, if that's okay, unless you wanted to say something. Did you want to say something?
No, I was going to introduce you, but no.
I didn't know, I thought you were, but then...
No, it's fine.
Is that all right?
You're doing that.
Okay. I left out a whole, you can't get it all in, and I read about the Elizabethan jig, and I was looking at the kind of pavan and the galliard as kind of processional dances. But I did come across this one little poem, and it's a discussion, it's a description of dancing, but I think it evoked braiding. It's from 1577. And he says, as Nicholas Brayton is the poet, he says, "And to it then, with set and turn about, change sides and cross, and mince it like a hawk, backwards and forwards, take hands then in and out, and now and then a little wholesome talk." Do we need, is this too loud? Is that okay? Okay, so as I say, this came out of basketry projects and textile manipulations, and one of the basketry projects was called Woven Communities, and it was based in Scotland. And I had to think up a second symposium paper, and I thought about the braid-like formations of Scottish country dancing, and the combination of braiding and dancing signalled a potential opening up of interesting lines around embodiment, active agency, pattern, and rhythm. And I'd been reading a lot of Erin Manning, which some of you may be familiar with, and her Sense Lab in Canada, which is very interesting, and kind of fed into this somewhere along the line. So I've been considering how braiding with materials, as in basketry and Japanese kumihimo, engages interactive rhythms, patterns, processes, and structures, which not only have resonance within the body of the maker and the braid that is formed, but also extended across, sort of through metaphor, across and between a range of practices and examples. So it has a terrific potential as metaphor braid does, to my mind. So the muscles of the arm, a braided river, or the patterns of certain kinds of bark might inhabit a context of braiding in this broad sense. It's not simply a braiding of ideas, nor a braiding as worked out technically by a maker, but between and across these, an active, growing, materially generative braiding process, such as watching people weaving in and out of one another on a busy pavement, or cars weaving in and out of a highway, or us talking to one another, but somehow brought together through intersecting strands, whether of whatever nature. So braiding has agency, it is mobile and relational like dancing. And within this broad view, patterning and rhythm as active in braiding and dancing are understood, and this is my kind of sort of somehow the heart of my own thinking, are understood as intrinsic to the biomorphology of connectivity as it infiltrates tissues of knowing. I said that quite slowly, because there's a lot in there, it's quite dense. I'll say it once more. So the patterning and rhythm understood as intrinsic to the biomorphology, that's, kind of form, biological form forming of connectivity as it infiltrates. Is infiltrate the right word? I'm not going to think about that now. As it infiltrates tissues of knowing. Okay, so somehow some of the things we've been talking about earlier will occur. And reflecting on relationships between religious thought and technicity, the philosopher Gilbert Simondon, in his Technicity of Objects, I think the book's called, laid emphasis on what he called the primitive reticulation of the magical world. And so I'm picking up on this word reticulation a little bit. He says, whereby, and I wrote it up, I don't usually do text, but I thought you might like to read it. The figural structure in primitive magical thought is inherent to the world. It is not detached from it. It is the reticulation of the universe into privileged key points. This is a little bit like your stars in the sky, I think, through which the exchanges between the living thing and its milieu come to pass. And I think I would want to plural the living thing, so between living things in some way. But so just as a sort of holding voice there. So reticulation, which is basically a net-like patterned arrangement of interlacing lines, is in Simondon's sense a link between a deep past and as yet to be organised future through technicity. So always on the being ordered or organised, but as yet there's never any final organising. My examples here will also span a wide time span, a time trajectory, with the maypole emerging as a sort of centre point, albeit with a kind of untidy, reticulated pattern, providing a rhythm or key. So three parts. So a sort of an introduction, which leads into dancing, from which maypoles lead to examples which will introduce something slightly new. They have architectural and robotic interest, and hopefully some of you will be able to pick up on some of that. So it's stimulated by the pattern-rich agency of matter. It is as if the symmetry and pattern inherent in the evolutionary physiology of the body, no, Leonardo there is useful. Can you see this one here? Are articulated and externalized in the object form of a braid. Such physiology is as if braided in itself, not only in the interconnectivity of muscles, tendons, joints, and nervous system. You'll be really glad that I didn't give you that lecture. It was getting a bit complicated. But also through the agency of bilateral symmetry and bipedal evolution, us being, two-footed creatures. Within this physiological para-braiding, the senses, notably in the kinesthetic relationship between haptic and optic, are especially and acutely active in the coming into being of braided form. And I want to sort of illustrate, this is here, I'll explain. So in return, the formation of the braid activates the coming into being of its maker. So I think having formed the braid then feeds back into the body of the maker in some way. Okay, it's a two-way process, not a one-way process. It's not just making objects. So through affordance of the beholder. Inspired by Husserl's idea of intertwining, Verflechtung, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenology of perception person, actually it's in his book Visible and Invisible. He focuses particular attention on the chiasmus, the chiasm, the crossing point or intertwining, the entrelac, interlace is the French word, whereby as if between the flesh of the body and the reflections of the mind, there is a double and crossed situating of the visible in the tangible and of the tangible in the visible. Okay, so it's a sort of haptic optic, and that's just the chiasmus. And I leave that on for a second, because I have one of my little ideas is that perhaps in this braiding which begins within the body, long or unruly hair, hence Leonardo, who's really interested in the braid, might serve as a precursor of braiding, with what then might become bundled strands of fine grass, for example. So hair of the body, a prosthetic, as it were. So we're dealing with a kind of a double prosthetic of the hands braiding whilst it's the hair that's braided. Is a textile. Hair is a textile medium that is both of the body at the same time as being an extension to it. It's flexible and directional, easily divided by the hand into roughly even-sized bundles of strands, which can then be shaped into an orderly pattern, serving both practical and aesthetic and increasingly symbolic ends, so that there's sort of narratives around hair that are also important. In this approximate context, the braiding activates the tool-like facility of the hands and fingers, maybe the dance-like tool-like facility of the hands and fingers, embodying and forming a not yet named geometry. So we haven't called it that yet. And there's a lot of evidence, increasing evidence of kind of elaborate hair braiding on figures from the Neolithic era, just as a matter of interest. And it's also just worth noting a crossover between hair braiding and rope. So the Greek trichia, meaning rope or tether, is derived from a Greek word for hair, and both are seeming thrix, and both are seemingly combined. Yes, so they both combined in the vulgar Latin word trichia, meaning braid and rope. And isn't that, what's tricot? Is that French for knitting? I'm sure there's another word, isn't it? Tricot. Is that knitting? Anyway, yes, thank you. Okay, so I think that kind of comes in there. So, oops, you're not saying no internet, are you? It's just me, that's right. The origins of the English word braid are interesting, and what's interesting is that they have less to do with intertwining than with rapid, jerky, zigzag movements from side to side, suggesting swords being brandished or a weaver's shuttle. The movements also function like sewing needles in action, hence the word embroidery. So the broid bit of embroidery is braid related, okay? Or knitting needles. In simple braiding, each continuous directional strand is turned at an angle, typically of 90 degrees, you'll see in the next picture, at the edges of the braid, zigzagging through the braided structure. Through the strong sense of rhythm and zigzag movement, there's a suggestion of dance, I would suggest, and dexterity and virtuosity are also pertinent to the notion of braid. So the Old English and Old Saxon bregden, from which Braiding then braid evolved, indicated movements so nimble as to be associated with a cunning sleight of hand, as well as referring to shaking, swinging, and joining together. And there's a whole line that one could take here on sword dances, but I haven't gone there. So that more or less there. Okay. So I've done some workshops, I might mention that later, but the three that I've done a workshop on braiding with rush, on kumihimo, and on esparto grass, and I've downloaded these from the internet, but just to they're all, hands are involved in all of them, as you can see. I particularly like this image, which is a little out of focus with her arms, and you can just see the speed with which she's in a workshop in Lowestoft, where they make rush carpets and mats as a commercial business. The distinctive, typically symmetrical, repeated and textured pattern that is formed is characteristic of the dance-like movements experienced in the making dance-like movements, thus interlacing under and over, crossing, or precisely numbered sequential steps form processional movement through iteration of actions. And from the knowing action of the hands as they work the materials, an inherently aesthetic length of braid gradually emerges as if giving shape to the measured actions. In theory, at least, a satisfying operational rhythm affects the formation of an equally satisfying visual rhythm in the pattern that results. In extending, hopefully that's reasonably clear, in extending and facilitating the formation and movements of the body, the actions affect a paraprosthesis, an advancing line, a kind of an illusion of growth. So it's a positive thing to braid, I think. In each instance, a long line of braid extends from the actions as if forming a prosthesis of the maker, while at the same time there's a process or an acting of centering, of being centered by the necessity of the pattern forming actions. And I found it a real struggle to be centered. It reminds me of when I once went on a kiln, went on a weekend somewhere, and there was a kiln, a potter's wheel, and the chap, it was a bit of a hippie sort of thing, it was way back in the early 70s, and he said, well, first you've got to centre yourself. And I spent all day centering myself, and could I make a pot? You know, so I'm a little bit inadequate in these things, but I did on occasion, particularly during the kumihimo, where very, very important is that somehow you will have to actually look in the centre to ensure that everything is kept even. There was definitely an experience from time to time. I could understand the sort of magical sense of interconnectivity and the feeding back of the braiding into the body. Materials have elicit agency, have energy and elicit movement too, In responding to materials, the hands of a braider differentiate meanings and patterns that not only originate within the body but also within the material that is worked. Really has become quite important to me to explore this further. Materials stimulate a response, and although they have invariably been processed to some extent, they nevertheless carry memory of their having come into being, according to a book on plant behaviour and intelligence, which I thought was, and I'm not going to go into the details of that. I'm not sure I could. But materials can be considered along with the body itself as co-respondents in the making process. We interact with them and they interact with us. For animal or plant materials, or their derivatives, traces of their organisation as living adaptive systems remain. They have structure, perform in certain ways, enabled by the actions we tease out of or impose on them, or that they tease out of us. Donna Haraway, her most recent book on kin, I forget the full title, she talks about weaving string figures and interlacing, to which I would like to add braiding, as especially potent manifestations of what she calls the relational action between human and non-human fibres, through which formations of, she goes further, she says formations of kinship and behaviour are sustained through this, so she would see it as a kind of distributed in a sort of social sense and political sense. So braiding and dancing both articulate patterns and processes of relational action. And I was going to say about the courses that I had done, but I don't think I need to. But I want to just say a well-made braid depends on really artful manipulation with fingers and hands, dancing, I think, separately and together, holding down, lifting, hooking up, tensioning, drawing apart, teasing apart, disentangling, twisting, folding, smoothing, ensuring even density, all the while adding more fibre of the appropriate dampness, density, pliability, or colour. So rhythm, and so that's important. One more thing on rhythm. A skillful braider quickly establishes a rhythm, a form of timing through a succession of synchronized moves or units of action. The archaeologist Vilica Vendrick examined basketry techniques, including plaiting, she uses the word plaiting, in Egyptian villages, and she noted that all skilled basket makers distinguish themselves by a very steady working rhythm, which is why I just never got the hang of it. Intense concentration, a very regular appearance of the product. But she also likens the making of the baskets to a kind of choreography for which the dance is the basket as a whole. Thus, the body as instrument, she talks about, engages most of the body, not just the hands, in a kind of choreography for which the basket, in its material aspects, is the dance itself. And it's not until watching the dance as a whole, she notes, that the meaning of the basket can be sensed. So the meaning is in the dancing that becomes the basket. Now, a sudden shift, because I want to talk about braiding and dancing. And talking about repeated movements. And in Scottish dancing, a set of repeated movements is known as a figure, a word rooted in the Latin figura, meaning a form or shape, which was in turn a translation of the Greek schema, which referred not only to shape and form, but also to dance. So there are all sorts of there's all sorts of etymological braiding going on, and I think translation is another kind of, we were talking earlier about it as a sort of a braiding kind of process. A figure in dancing, conceived thus as a formation or a shaping, creates a pattern of movements that are repeated. It's also worth noting, I think, that the familiar phrase figure of 8 not only indicates the shape of the number 8 or describes a knot, but also describes a motif in Scottish dancing in which one or more dancers follows the path of a figure of 8, moving around either standing figures or one another, creating a figure or braid-like reticulation through succession. Dances often tell stories, such as Strip the Willow. There's an Orcadian version which you can have down the whole street with the whole village, which is very nice. But Strip the Willow, which can be likened to a loose figuring of willow being stripped of its bark, while also enabling the turning and interlinking with one another passage of the leading couple as they strip along the lines from head to foot, or in basketry terms, from tip to butt of your bit of willow. So to the rhythm of musical accompaniment. It also involves figures of 8 turning the partner often more vigorously as the music speeds up at the end. Although it's often a cultural reinvention rather than reflecting a continuous tradition, country dancing, as we know it, is a deeply embedded social practice which is coded and patterned in dynamic relation, for example, with times of the year, and within which relationships are articulated and can be fostered. There's friendliness and perhaps suggestive touching, but the dance patterns keep everything in order, so you can't get too close, and we braid social coherence. So when we dance, we twine, perhaps as a prelude to entwining or later tying the knot, as it were. And this social relational active braiding provides a way of lightening the burdens of hard lives. And although the example on your right is of walking, which you may or may not know about, it's a kind of fulling part of the textile production process. So it's a Hebridean walking. I think it's worth including here. It's a social process which involves a vigorous action as they thump, moisten and move newly woven cloth round a table in a swinging action, or they did until mechanisation took over, accompanied by robust singing. And in fact, the woman at the end, or is it a woman? It's a boy, actually, isn't it, in that picture? It was sort of, I think, guided the singing a little bit, I think, probably. There was almost like a caller in Ceilidh dancing to set the singers on their way. And I do really recommend, if you do nothing else, is to watch Werner Kisling's Eric Sate's a film that he made in silent film, but somebody's added some words and music, but it's still really worth watching, from the 1930s. Okay. Scottish country dances were generically known as reels, perhaps from the whirling and turning associated with the reeling of a spool. In the 16th century, reel also had the meaning of a zigzag path, as if in the manner of hither and thither. The reel figure was associated with a serpentine country dance known as the Hay, H-E-Y or H-E-Y, or Heidegay, which was praised by Hogarth in his analysis of beauty. He said one of the most pleasing movements in country dance, what they call the Hay, the figure of it, altogether a cipher of S's, or a number of serpentine lines interlacing, and he has this lovely word, or intervolving one another. So this interlacing might indicate the rationale behind the fact that hay also meant a net for catching fish, or a woven hedge. And then 2 very, very brief examples that I'm not going to go into. And I just loved this image of the double. I'm really interested in notation, as others have mentioned earlier, and that was one, in the end, the only one that I got left in. But just to indicate recent research into suggestion, evidence, just about evidence, about a continuation between 7th and 8th century Irish interlace and almost contemporary dance still going on in Lancashire, a sort of male bonding dance between either 3 or 4 people. So it's just really a sliding past there. And an even more sliding past, a kind of totally reinvented, probably almost totally reinvented, you never know with Ireland, a reenactment of a sort of straw boy tradition, which is related to Morris dancing and similar rituals, the German Morriskentanz, and similar rituals in North Italy, Alpine, Eastern European context. So I happened to come across a couple of dancing. This was the close I could get to, and I can't identify the source of the image, to the possibility that these straw boys dance. But you can see they're covered in costume, which is braided. And the hat is terribly important with its kind of, little braided sort of arms as they are. In The maypole dance, or related seasonal dances such as the Tamil traditional penal kolatan, or the one that I really loved as I came across was a Jamaican dance. It's kind of like in a nightclub at night, and it's really slow and musical, and they are just having a good time. So it's a really broad cultural tradition, a kind of maypole pops up in all sorts of places. But braiding and dancing are irrevocably combined in expression or a reenactment of cultural memory. For John Ruskin, the combination of dancing and braiding around the maypole was especially significant. And there are connections with Sheffield. Some of those of you who are from Sheffield will know that he established the St George's Museum, but he may, because his interest in the maypole came after his Sheffield initiatives, and I suggest that he may have encountered local instances of maypole revival, such as in the nearby town of Buxton, as well as in surrounding towns. So in Buxton, records of men dancing the ribbon dance, called the ribbon dance, interestingly, who plait them into a variety of forms. Morris dancers, young men gaily decorated with ribbons, this is a quotation, who come dancing down the hill, and when they reach the pole in the centre of the crescent, fasten the long ribbons to it, and in mystic evolutions plait them into a variety of forms as they execute what is called the ribbon dance. So anyway, perhaps Ruskin knew of this. But he organised a May festival in 1881 in a teachers' training college for girls. And there's a whole unpleasant side of Ruskin and young girls, which we're going to leave just to one side and move on from. So garlanded May Queen, and then a few years later a maypole in which the ribbons were dexterously plaited and unplaited, twined and untwined by 8 maidens. And the annual iteration of this, and because it was a teachers' training college for not wealthy girls to train to be teachers, it was spread far and wide through the teachers going off into their schools, as it were. I'm going to just miss that. But there is an interesting aspect to all of this, which is a kind of... Ruskin was really interested in the finest geometric patterns of webs of quartz, and more delicate than your finest lace. And it has been suggested that there's he got all these girls to kind of, I don't know, almost dance the pattern of the quartz. And someone has suggested that it's like a conversion of science into dance. Now, you can see there that there is an industrial maypole braid. So these last couple of examples, am I all right for time? Am I got nearly finishing? I know, I'm sorry. So I do want to just point you in the direction of some architecture and some robotics, so bring myself up to date or into the future. So one of the people here is a guy called Lars Spoibroek, and he's very interesting in his book called The Sympathy of Things. He talks about the connective interlacing characteristics of braid as a significant conceptual framework, which is as embedded within materials as it is within consciousness. Infinitesimal detail structures pattern, and he's drawing on Ruskin here. Infinitesimal detail structures pattern and materiality, such as to take on the quality of thought. But he's also an architect, and he's really interested in the relationship between Ruskin and the digital. It's a really kind of extraordinary journey that he makes. But he describes technology as acting on the inside of matter, and pattern as an effect of the self-crafting of matter. So threads are lines of force, whether in nature, in baskets, carpet pages, or maypole dancing, or whatever. He is so I'm just going to go through those very quickly, and he does have various pages on braiding, and including hair braiding, and then gets his students to braid a building, which of course isn't a building that we could live in. But it's not a built building. The only one that's built here is the Akim Mengiz filament pavilion, and the only thing about this, not really braided, but it's made by robots, so that you know that there is a kind of now entering into all of this field is the robotic braid of buildings. So on the one hand they can grow, and on the one hand they can be braided, on the other hand they can be braided. Okay, so just a couple of, and I've got these are pages from last Spoibrek as well. And one more little example, I'm not going to be able to go to both of them, but there is a really interesting project called Flora Robotica. And they use braid as a universal organizational structure. It's a sort of typology for them. It's a big EU-funded project, 2015 to 19, and concerned with future and emerging technologies within the theme of knowing, doing, and being. Braid emerges as a central to encompassing mechanical scaffolds to support plants and robots and electronics, embedded soft body robot arms. Now, you might be able to get it better from here, that can be actuated and manufactured through distributed control. That's about as much as I can understand of it, but I think it's really interesting. So one of their outcomes is a swarm-based model, you can see, which is my maple-like version here, whereby robots that unroll threads or growing plants are programmed or influenced to braid. And this is envisaged as being used in an architectural context, whereby users will be able to configure swarms of braiding agents, designing spaces in virtual reality. But there is an ultimate thing is that they can be used to make buildings. In some way, buildings will be able to grow. And that's an image there. And yes, but really one of the things I wanted to say is that when they work out the computer program, in order to work out the computer program, and I think it's more complicated, I'm not going to have time to go into it, but they do it by hand first. So they do a whole lot of experiments by hand, and these feed into the technology. And if anybody wants more, I do have one or two more examples that are interesting in terms of braiding. But I'm going to just close by this image, which is from a contemporary designer, Maria Blaze, a Dutch designer. And this piece, which, because through electronic signals, senses, the piece at the top, it's a breathing sphere, so it gradually expands and contracts, made out of braiding bamboo. So we have to put breath at the end, at the beginning of all of this and end. And so, thank you very much. Sorry to rush.
So we're going to continue along the dancing, and Rosa Cisernos is going to present. She's with us from Coventry. She's a researcher and dancer herself.
Hello everyone. So I know it's a hard time of the day, so I'll take you on a little journey. I'll tell you a little bit about flamenco, some of the projects that I've done. Well, not some. One project that I've done that used technology, but also incorporated the more traditional side of flamenco. And then I'll show you some videos, and then we'll do something together. Just so, please be open, yeah? So we've been talking a lot about patterns and bodies and embodied knowledge. So really beautiful talk. So thank you, the organizers and everyone. I think there's a lot of really beautiful work out there that I get really inspired by, and then I think, oh yeah. But I'm here to talk about some of my work. So yes, I work at Coventry University. Sorry, I should put that back. I work at Coventry University at the Center for Dance Research, but I'm also still a dancer and choreographer. And I think that's really important to keep, because it feeds into the identity of my research. The practice informs the research, and the research has informed my practice in ways that I didn't imagine. Now I work a lot with technologists. I'm classically trained. I'm also a traditionally trained flamenco dancer. So technology was always something you put the video in front of, and that was how you kind of documented dance. And that's totally changed, working at CDARE and some of the projects there have really changed some of that. And that's also gone back into the flamenco community, and, we're starting to kind of open up these conversations around, flamenco is a living, breathing art form that's still evolving. It's not a folk dance. It's changing, so we can also adapt to and incorporate technology in a new way. So that's been you could say now my mission is to, you know, get some flamencos and just dancers in general to be a bit more open to technology in that relationship. So yes, when I think about dance, and especially in flamenco, we think a lot of time, space, and energy. Dance has patterns, but flamenco in specific, I'll be here today as a flamenco dancer, but it's built around rhythm. So yes, you know, there is the body, there is the sounds, and well, actually, when I say flamenco dance, what comes to mind? Hands. Posture. Footwork. So all of that, but that's kind of the last part of it. The first thing, I come from a Gitano, a gypsy family, so I was raised with flamenco in a very kind of traditional way. It was given to me in, you know, talking, sharing. It's not something you study, you know, so when I went to study dance and classical ballet, that was, you know, so foreign for my mother. And when I said to her, I'm going to major in dance, you know, what do you mean? What kind of life will you have with dance? So I then went and got another degree so that I could still do the dance. And I got both degrees to make her happy, and now, you know, I can do both. But again, it was that fear of like, this is ours, this is something we do, we embody, we share, it's for our circle. And, you know, that's from within the community. And so, yeah, that's just kind of informed me. But the flamenco I was always taught it's a language as well. It has its own language, and it's not necessarily ABC. It's ta, tu, 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 ta, ko, ka. And that comes from the history of flamenco and from that Romani gypsy background, which is from India. So Kathak and Bharatanatyam directly have influenced flamenco. There's a long history in there that I won't kind of get into today, and I know that that's a community that's, you know, brings up lots of conversations, and I won't get into that. We could, if you wanted to. But again, there's something that the art form, the body, the music, the dancing is very much a part of that community, and it's survived in many ways or reacted to its environments through that, and the body has represented and carried that knowledge and that history. So a lot of the temperaments, the face, the posture, is born from that socio-political, economic reality that the community, as well as the Kathak and so, you know, this language that I'm talking about is built from its history, but also these other art forms that the community has traveled through. So I've put on there two different patterns. So if we looked at, I'll jump back and forth. Flamenco has these three, you could say, components. As you can see, this music is the number one, compás, which translates as rhythm. Then we have the singing and the toque, which is the guitar. The dancing is not there, but it is a part of that. And it's kind of not an add-on, but if there's a hierarchy, it's always the music, which can be the singer or the rhythm, the musician, and then the dancing. So in that conversation, the dancer is always listening. So there's something about input and output there. Well, we're always having a conversation and listening to one another, but it's very much a structured improv. So that conversation is happening. You learn to speak the language through the sounds, through recognizing certain patterns. But then there's also a lot of interpretation, and I know that's come up today a bit that, you know, that we have a language, but then it's also how you're interpreting this rhythm. So here's one example. It's hard for me to count it out because, you know, I've had to learn to do it as a teacher, but, you know, for me the natural thing is but I'll do it counting first. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So what I've done there, flamenco is 12 counts. And you don't say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Don't know why, but it's always done this little like loop. And that's where you enter or exit from in that little loop. So that 1, 2 is a marker. So if the guitarist decided to start on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, I'd know that I'd have to wait for him to finish or for her to finish. Or if they started 1, 2, then I'd have to be ready to jump in at the 1, 2, 3, 4. So again, it's a different way of looking at rhythm. But that would be one way to start to think about one of the rhythms that exists within flamenco. Flamenco, if you think of it as a tree, has several branches, several rhythms. They're all 12 counts, they're just accented differently. And, you know, when people are trying to learn or enter the world of flamenco, they get into this 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That is an entry point, but that becomes quite rigid. And if you just go, if you go back and see the accents as breaths, moments to breathe, it's a little bit easier to embody that rhythm. And then you get the loop a little bit easier. You get to kind of sense, because we all know how to, well, we all breathe. And so that becomes part of the training. But to get people who want to get it right, to, you know, I got to get, you know, the numbers is the place to start. So, you know, and I remember, especially when I was training, it can get really complex. And of course I go, but where was the, you know, but that? No, Rosa, you know, you have to listen. And I was trying to see, you know, okay, but I need to know when the guitarist is going to do this. And, you know, they were saying, he can't tell you, or she can't tell you that. You have to listen to it. And, you know, that's one of the hardest things, that the listening, that going back to trying to listen to the pattern, while you're also taking in and having outputs of the dance, you know, but that's also really alive in the moment. And I think that embodied knowledge, embodied history comes out in that, in a way that, you know, maybe you were kind of referencing today, it teaches you how to problem solve, and, you know, this kind of old way, you have to learn to do this. Not because you're going to be a flamenco dancer, but because you have to learn to listen to people. You have to learn to be aware. So that was, you know, our brothers hate flamenco, hate it, but they reference it as kind of a cultural thing, as a way of living. So it's talked about that. A little bit about flamenco technique. We touched a little bit on that this morning, around movement principles, movement qualities. These are just some examples of different ways to think about the body within musical patterning, musical ways of I think, entering into the pattern that is flamenco. Flamenco does weave the body, but it weaves the body within music, within a musicality, within a history that becomes visible when you bring these three components together. And I mean the rhythm, the singing, the dancing, and the toque. There's an idea in flamenco about being grounded, and in flamenco whether it's the guitarist or the singer or the dancer, that being grounded, it's maybe easier in dance to think about if you have your pelvis, your pelvic bowl, you somehow have to kind of, that weight has to, the pelvis grounding into the floor. And it seems like it would be an easy thing because, you know, you're stomping into the ground, but you're thinking about the way your feet hit the ground. So you don't think of it as the ground or the earth would be an extension of your body. So it's you go into the floor in a very respectful way rather than just trying to kind of use it to make a sound. So then with that, everything comes from this area in flamenco. So that's your breath, that's your sound, that's your singing, your guitar playing, all of that is going to come from here. And in dance, it's very easy to kind of, you know, see that, because it's like, oh yeah, the pelvis, you just, you know, it's a swing. But it's a swing that never stops. Uno, dos. Yeah, so how you enter that swing, or that pattern, you decide. So you have some control in that. yeah, again, this is just examples of technique, of how you would carry a bit of what you said, carrying the body, the hands. You know, there's all of this stuff happening, but it's the technique, yes, that allows you to have the efficiency and to be on stage and to preserve your body, of course. I mean, this is if you want to do it professionally. And, you know, being classically trained, I was too big in ballet. You know, they always told me I was too big. I was terrible at jumping. I never had the ballon. But, you know, I loved it. And then going back into flamenco, it was very easy to kind of have, you know, the carriage that I needed in the arms. But somehow, you know, they never really talked to one another, especially when I was training. Now it's more kind of everyone does a little bit of everything, and, you know, now it's okay. But when I first started ballet, it was very kind of, you know, I was young, and those two worlds needed to remain separate. The breathing and the, you know, people shouldn't see my pelvis moving very much, and so that was really difficult for my body that was used to having this swing. And I just learned that ballet had a different swing and a different way of breathing. And then it made sense, and now, you know, I love it. And yeah, so I think both dancers should do both techniques, or all techniques, yeah. Again, I've been talking a lot about the female body, but male dancers are traditionally, they were the ones that did the footwork, and the women did a lot of the upper body. So there was a lot of this happening with the dresses and the costuming. I'm not going to talk too much about the costuming, but that's a really important part of flamenco dancing, because those costumes can weigh 10, 20 pounds. What is that in kilograms? It's heavy, yeah, it's really heavy. And that changes your dancing, that changes how you move on stage, and that becomes another extension of you that, you know, it takes years. I can't tell you how many times I've fallen on. If you've seen those long train dances, train skirts, they're beautiful. I mean, the women that make those things are absolutely, such an art form. And then you think, oh, I have to wear that to dance in it. But it's so restrictive, and and that changes the movement as well. And that, you know, is another thing that, let's make it look pretty on stage, and it's about this. So it's now, you know, they've given more kind of their new materials, and it's changed a bit. But the men kind of always had it quite easy. They would wear a little jacket, and lots of the movement reflects the jacket or the long train dresses. So again, there's another component of this external part of making that comes into the dance that has informed that, as well as informed the music. So there are several branches of flamenco music, and depending on the region of where you're from in Spain, you know, if you're from there's an alegrías, which is very heavy and light, and the movement reflects this lightness, and then there's some that are quite, you know, those reflect that, or the part of I'll show you an example of. But again, the costuming also is very much a part of that. Here's the European Horizon 2020 project that I was part of with CEDAR. It's a lovely project. It brought, well, I'll show you the video. But it was 3 years. We had technologists, dancers, motion capture. Yeah. project created several tools that we wanted to use in educational environments as well as in choreographic environments, and it pushed the boundaries of looking at, it brought together Greek folk dance, contemporary modern dance, ballet, and flamenco, and where are the similarities, and and what language emerges from that. So we had to do a lot of machine learning to teach the machines how to find the dance and look at where some of those patterns were, and we had to also reflect a lot on the movement qualities and those principles that I showed you at the beginning, but also what language do we use in flamenco? I'm telling you, we use da, do, 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 da. How do we put that into a machine and teach the machine to then use that in a choreographic environment? So there are lots of conversations. We haven't found the right way. There's so many ways to do this, but one thing is, we also did a lot of annotation, so breaking down, all of these steps. Where are we similar? Where are we not? Where's the tension that arises? And why are we doing this? Who cares that we can annotate a dance? So what does that do? How does it help us reflect on these embodied practices? But it's fascinating, especially for the Greek folk dance and flamenco that are so rhythm-based. How do you, if you remove that, then what is the body telling us? We can talk more about that. Yeah, just some research outputs. There are more, but I just thought I'd highlight those, that they were very specific to dance within the. And here's an example of some dancing that's kind of popular. It uses non-standard flamenco music. It has a lot of ballet. It's very pretty. It has a lot of the weaving that I think flamenco uses a lot of. But it's very much about the dancers and those girls. It's beautiful. Okay, and this is a more traditional kind of flamenco dance. Everyone's looking at the singer. It's not necessarily pretty. And now the dancer is deciding to enter. I mean, this is a film, so obviously it's staged, but this process of kind of getting a sense of the space, communicating to the artist, you see that there's always a few what we call palmeros in the background because the rhythm is so important. So he's communicating to the guitarist that he's going to start soon. So again, there's this conversation happening. I'll just get to where there's... again, that pattern, they're walking that pattern, but it's also kind of getting a sense for where you are within that pattern and how you're going to weave in and out of that with respect to the... So, yeah, let's do our live duet. Yes, shall we? So, I've been talking about rhythm. Yes, I'll do very easy rhythm. Yes, so let's take our hands. I'll do this. Yeah, let's take our hands. Just shake them. Yeah. So, watch and listen first. Yeah? I'll count it just for those that like numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Easy enough, no? So you will keep that, and I will speak to you, and you will speak to me. You have to keep the rhythm, yeah? So you hold that, because I will follow you. Okay? So I'll get you started, and then I'll come in and out. Yes? So E. I'm listening, you guys were keeping okay the tempo, I can do this, I can do that, yeah? So at the end I thought, yeah, they're okay, that's some footwork. And so that's just the conversation we're having. So you're maintaining and we're having that conversation together, yeah? So great, thank you. I think that's it, yeah? My references, and thank you.
That was worth kind of cutting into some discussion time for. Do we have any kind of opening questions or anything anybody wants to ask? Yeah? So when I think of, I come a little bit more from an engineering perspective, and so when I think about kind of braiding and weaving and things, I think first of the kind of the engineering properties of you're taking a weaker material and the combination of them results in the stronger and strengthens. It's kind of more than the sum of its parts. But then of course there's the balance of the aesthetic appeal of it as well. And the braiding is also decorative. And I don't know if there's kind of to talk more kind of is there a tension there between decorative and form and function?
What I found really interesting in the way the architects and the robot people are using braid is because it's strong and flexible. So it's those properties that are really important. But they also always mention maypoles, and they always mention the aesthetic properties as one aspect of the fact that braid matters, as it were. So the aesthetic I think is interesting in as much as we can break it or make it. We can break the aesthetic and we can change it, and it's clearly more flexible as a pattern than we traditionally think of. And you look at all those hair designs, they're quite extraordinary what you can do. But so they can have meaning, and aesthetics without meaning is a bit dry anyway. So it can have a cultural function. So the aesthetic, but the other things I think are really more. Do you think? I mean, I think the cultural things for flamenco.
Yes, I think there used to be more function in flamenco, and it's now shifted because of this Broadway flamenco and the dancer being the most important thing into the aesthetic. So the dancer is the thing that is has to be in front and has to be decorated and decorates the music, but it wasn't always like that. So yeah, I think that we need to go back to a balance of form, function, and that aesthetic.
Oh, yes.
I'm trying to think of something that now connects the two, and one thing that struck me was Victoria, at the start of your presentation, you mentioned that you were reading some Erin Manning's work.
Yes.
Anyone sort of read any Erin Manning's work? There's a thing that she talks about in writing about this notion of pre-acceleration of a movement before movement happens. And when I was watching the way that people were talking about flamenco, I was just really interested in this idea of where did the actual movement begin? Because before it became actualized, there was a whole set of watching and waiting and responding and listening. And maybe it goes back to the conversation from this morning about this difficulty between sort of notation systems which is to do with articulating the form that the movement takes, because movement has a vitality that comes way before you see it. So there's something about that I was thinking a lot about, really. I don't know if it's possible to respond to that.
I think it's interesting, the breathing and the rhythm, the relationship between the breathing and the rhythm, and the way that almost you're making us, I'm not really doing clapping at the moment, but you're making us kind of clap, and it's almost as if your breathing almost would become akin to that. And also, so there's a woman called Felicity Irons who has a place called Rush Matters, and they do lots of braiding for mats and so forth. And she says when they're working together, several of them, and they'll be working together, maybe have the radio on or something, and then they'll turn it off, and they suddenly feel they're all doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. So there's a kind of, so as if dancing together. So there's a kind of interesting, and so there's a movement. Well, it's not quite, but we generate movement in a way, or we generate timing, which I think is really interesting. We can, I thought the counting thing is really fascinating. The way that time and matter intersect through our actions. But yes, the Manning is really interesting in just sort of thinking about the senses in relationship to movement and dance, and how it enters into everything is absolutely sort of knowledge foundation.
I mean, I think that's a key part of flamenco is your experiences, the things that happen outside of that moment. You're bringing it with you, and that informs the movement or the rhythm or the way that you're approaching that moment. So there's a saying that the older you are, the better dancer you are, because you have more to offer, more to bring to the moment. So it's not about that aesthetic, but rather about that history. And the other point is, it's not about you dancing, it's about generations of you and coming into that, and you're part of a legacy. And something also about maypole dancing, you're doing that together, and that the body is making something that then becomes visible. And I think with flamenco, you're creating something together that the body is allowing to somehow reflect the doing of the music in a way, different way.
Inside, outside.
Yeah,
There's a lot of kind of it hidden within, becoming something without that then loops back into sort of kind of looping, really, which is interesting.
That's right.
Just a serpentine.
Yeah.
I was quite struck how the diagram you had of the country dancing actually had quite strong similarities to the weaving diagram that Arima had earlier, of kind of the woven waft moving across things, instead now with people moving in it.
Now there's something about notation that's really fascinating. How do you notate flamenco?
I can tell you how I annotated it and how others did it, and it was very different. But the technology allowed us that platform to start opening up those discussions. So that was really nice to see. And you were saying earlier that, you know, the woman would put her body into the weaving, and that tension between, you know, the thread, and, you know, that's very much a part of what becomes that final product. And I think that's the same in the dances we're talking about today.
So getting a notation, which reminded me a little bit of your image this morning of the figures photographed that you photographed, that then become almost a kind of pattern. That whole physiognomy, as it, physiology in relationship to the appearance is interesting. Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist, he says, making which is performative, interlocking, going around, touching, directional, ever-changing, active, social and patterned. He says it's related to an almost universal linkage in aesthetics between skill and pattern. So that's the aesthetics, but I don't think you didn't necessarily need to have those. He says it's a system which is both internally patterned and itself part of a larger patterned universe. So it's that kind of those stars again coming in, those rays, those threads of light.
I remember about when you started your presentation, you talk about the pin weaving, pin braiding, and I remember there is a thing that connects every mammals, like a chordata filum.
Right.
Every mammal has a cord in the beginning. So if we were
we're all braided. We emerge from the braid, or something, or connected always.
And then we develop in different speeds. But
I think there are universal there are sort of mythological things around sort of braid, and rather as there are for net and all textile. Technologies kind of have this unifying principle, I think, don't they? You know, it's very interesting.
And then we developed the symmetrical, and I remember when you do this movement when you weave, you are using both parts of the body. It's not the writing movement that you need just only one side of your brain. You need both hands and I guess both sides of your brain in order to make part of the system.
That's important, I think, those two halves of the brain. In Flamenco, each half does something different quite often.
Oftentimes, yes. So there's a lot of asymmetry, and there's, you know, your feet are always doing different things. Your hands are, but you're trying to stay within that 12-count rhythm. So that's the kind of the uniform and the thing that keeps you together from not quite losing it.
But you're balancing the two halves.
And you're balancing,
are
but the pelvis is always the one taking the impact and taking the impact. Here's a technique, that's balancing out the rhythm and keeping you in the rhythm, in the swing of it.
And the swing is, I think, swing is a really useful word here.
Yeah,
actually, the Nigerian. Jamaican maypole was a terrific swing kind of quality, the music.
And people get that word swing. When I say, you know, the do, but they understand that swing, that something has to go back and return, and then they see, okay, I can enter, if the swing is from here to here, I can come here, and then, you know, it becomes visual, and then, that's easier.
I wanted to say something, I suppose it connects a bit to what Sandra was saying this morning about the way in which working with that particular structure of weaving structured your way of thinking in response to the world. It was something to do with almost like working with choreographers and dancers. I think it's really showed up to me the way in which my own thinking was conditioned by not being a dancer. And just that way in which, we talk about embodiment, but we live that out in different ways because of how we use our bodies. I don't know where I'm going with this. And I suppose it's kind of like something to do with the body image that you have that's structured through the dominant modes of thinking that you inhabit. So I write a lot, I think a lot. I feel like this is my zone of embodiment in a way, where I know that dancing colleagues have quite a different perception of the body. And the braiding was making me think a lot then about fascia, which I think is a braiding structure, and what fascial thinking might be.
Yeah. No, I looked into that quite a lot, and they were interesting, but I'm not biologic. I'm not strong enough to feel confident enough.
Sure.
No, I mean, I know I'm putting it forward. I mean, it's a metaphor or a motif in a way. That kind of thinking feels as if it would be very, very different to sort of skeletal thinking or a mind thinking, or the way in which we think of our body. I think perhaps invites different kinds of thinking structures, which could be very exciting. And then there was what's the implication of coding?
Yeah.
If you think about that.
Do you think the more virtual our world becomes, the body actually is being drawn out of itself in ways that, the more that we become technologically adept, do you think
I'm not sure. I mean,
does that lead to a different kind of reflection on the way that the body works?
Currently I'm working with a researcher, Sophie Hedwick, who's based at Birmingham. She's doing a lot of research on VR and dance. And in a way, you could say that digital technologies inescapably lead to a sense of disembodiment. But actually, what the research is showing is that there's other kinds of embodiment that it shows up, and actually ways in which our Western habitual ideas of inside-outside are being challenged by digital technology. So it opens up a much more expanded notion of embodiment than we are in the West used to thinking. So I think there's complexity in there that's worth exploring.
Thank you for that.
Well, we now have a fresh pot of coffee that has just been brought in, so perhaps we should celebrate our bodies and caffeine.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry. I